My daughter-in-law told my son that I smelled like a bait shop and that I had no business sitting at her family's Christmas table. My son didn't raise his voice, he didn't slam a door, he just said, "Okay." And then he did something that nobody in that room saw coming. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 38 years working on the water. Lake Erie mostly. Out of Port Stanley, Ontario, I ran a small charter fishing operation. 4 boats at the peak, down to 2 by the time my knees started complaining. And I built it from nothing. I didn't inherit it. I didn't borrow from anybody. I worked the early mornings when the fog sat so thick on the water you couldn't see the bow from the stern. And I came home smelling like fish and diesel and whatever the lake decided to throw at me that day. My wife, Lorene, used to say the smell never fully washed out. She said it with a smile, though. She loved that lake almost as much as I did. She passed 6 years ago, cancer, quick and cruel, and after that it was just me and the house we'd built together in 1987, the one with the wraparound porch and the big red maple out front that drops leaves into the eavesdrows every October like it's doing it on purpose. My son, my boy, I'll call him my son the way I've always thought of him, which is with a fullness in my chest that's hard to describe. He moved to Toronto when he was 24. He works in project management for a construction firm downtown. He's good at it. Focused. He got that from his mother. He met his wife at a work function 5 years ago, and when he brought her home the first time, I shook her hand and thought, "She's sharp." I meant it as a compliment. Her parents live in North York. Her father is a financial advisor. Her mother volunteers on the board of 2 different arts organizations. They have a house that, the first time I saw it, made me think about how much square footage a person actually needs before it stops being a home and starts being a statement. I'm not saying that to be unkind. I'm just telling you what I noticed. The first Christmas after my son and his wife got married, we all went to her parents' place. I drove up from Port Stanley, about 2.5 hours, and I showed up with a cooler of lake perch I'd caught and cleaned myself. Because that's what I bring people. It's the best thing I have to give. Her mother thanked me and put the cooler in the garage. I didn't say anything. I figured different people, different customs. Some folks don't know what to do with fresh fish. That's fine. The second Christmas, I was invited again. I brought the same thing. Her father shook my hand and made a comment about how I must have come straight from the docks. I had showered. I was wearing the good flannel shirt Lorene had bought me the last Christmas before she got sick. I smiled and said I'd come from home, and he nodded like I'd confirmed something he already believed. I noticed things that evening, small things. The way the conversation shifted when I talked about the fishing operation, not hostile, just a degree cooler, like a window had been cracked open in winter. The way her mother asked my son what his 5-year plan was, right in front of me, as though my son having a father who ran charter boats was a temporary condition he might grow out of. I drove home that night with the radio off, just the highway and the dark. My son called me the next day and said he'd had a wonderful time. I told him I was glad. I meant it. His happiness is not a small thing to me. This past December, I got a call from my son about 3 weeks before Christmas. He sounded a little stiff, the way he gets when he's trying to be careful about something. He said his wife's family was doing Christmas again at her parents' place, and that it was going to be a bigger gathering this year. Her aunt and uncle from Calgary were flying in, and there'd be family friends, maybe 20 people total, and that they were thinking it might be easier if I celebrated separately with him and his wife, maybe Boxing Day instead. I said, "Of course, whatever works." He said, "Are you sure, Dad?" I said, "Your old man's flexible." We hung up and I sat in my kitchen for a while with my coffee going cold. I'm not a man who cries easily, but I'm also not a man who doesn't notice when a door gets quietly closed in his face. I didn't say anything to my son about how that felt. I figured it was his marriage and his life, and I wasn't going to be the reason for any friction. I went into the new year carrying it the way you carry a stone in your boot, Not crippling, but always there. In February, my son came down to Port Stanley for a weekend. Just us. We went out on one of the boats even though it was cold enough to make your fingers ache, and we caught a few walleye and mostly just talked about nothing. The Leafs, a property he was thinking of buying, whether I'd thought about scaling back the operation any further. At some point on the second day, he brought up Christmas. He said, "I need to tell you something, Dad, and I've been trying to figure out how to say it for a while." I told him to just say it. He told me that the decision to have me celebrate separately hadn't been his. It had been his wife's, and he told me why. She had told him. This was her exact word, he said, and he repeated it carefully, like he was ashamed of it. She had told him that her parents found my presence jarring, that I was, in her words, too rough around the edges for their kind of gathering, that I smelled like a bait shop, that her mother had mentioned it twice after last Christmas, and her father had said something about how hard it was to have a real conversation with someone who'd spent 40 years on a boat. My son said he had agreed to the Boxing Day arrangement because he was trying to keep the peace. And then he said, "But I've been sick about it ever since, Dad, and I can't pretend I'm not." I looked out at the water. A thin rim of ice along the breakwall, gray sky, the sound of the rigging on the boats. I said, "How long have you been carrying that?" He said, "Since November." I nodded. I didn't say anything for a long moment. There wasn't much to say that the lake wasn't already saying better than I could. Eventually, I told him that I appreciated him telling me, that it took something to say it out loud, and I told him I wasn't angry with him. He said, "What about with her?" I said, "That's not a question I'm going to answer right now. What I was actually thinking about was a winter about 30 years ago when my son was maybe 7 or 8 years old and he got it in his head that he wanted to help me on the boat. It was a Sunday in March. We were doing maintenance, not fishing, and I let him come along. He was small enough then that his life jacket came up to his ears. He handed me tools I didn't ask for and dropped a wrench overboard and stood at the stern for 20 minutes watching where it sank like it might come back up. On the drive home he smelled like bilge water and he fell asleep in the passenger seat with his mouth open. I carried him inside. Lorene had dinner waiting. I thought about that the whole drive back from the marina. 2 weeks later, my son called me on a Thursday evening. He sounded different. Not stiff. Something else resolved, maybe. He told me he'd had a conversation with his wife, a real one. He said he'd told her that the way her family had spoken about me wasn't something he was able to keep going along with, that he understood her parents were different from me, and that was fine, but that different did not mean better, and that I had worked every day of my adult life to give him every opportunity he'd ever had. And if her parents couldn't sit across a table from a man like that without being uncomfortable, then maybe the problem wasn't with me. He said his wife had gotten quiet for a while, and then she'd cried, and then she'd said that she'd never actually thought about it that way, that she'd just been trying to make her parents comfortable and had stopped asking herself what it was costing him, or me. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "That's a hard thing for a person to admit." He said, "I know." I said, "She gets credit for that." He said, "I told her you'd say something like that." What came next surprised me. His wife called me herself, not a long call. Her voice was careful the way a person's voice is when they're saying something they mean but aren't sure how it'll land. She said she was sorry. She said it plainly without too many words around it. She said she had been trying to manage her parents instead of standing up for her husband's family, and that she understood now how that must have felt, and that she was sorry. I told her I accepted her apology. I meant it. I told her that people make mistakes when they're trying to keep everyone happy, and nobody teaches you where to draw the line. I told her that my wife, her son's grandmother, I almost said, then caught myself, that my wife Lorene used to say that the people who love you are not always the people who make you comfortable, And the people who make you comfortable are not always the people who love you. I said I hoped she'd have a chance to know which was which before too long. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "That's a really beautiful way to put it." I said that was Lorene's. I just borrowed it. This past Easter, I drove up to Toronto. We had dinner at my son's place. The three of us, just us, a simple meal. My daughter-in-law made roasted chicken, and I brought a bottle of Ontario Riesling from a winery down near Niagara that a friend of mine had recommended. After dinner, she asked me about the boats. She asked real questions. How do you read the water? How do you know where the fish are? How do you handle the lake in October when the weather turns? She leaned forward when I talked, the way people do when they're actually listening. At one point, my son got up to do the dishes, and it was just me and her at the table for a few minutes. She looked at me and said, "I want you to know that next Christmas is going to be different. I'm going to make it different." I said, "You don't have to do anything on my account." She said, "I know I don't have to. That's kind of the point." I drove home that night with the radio on low. The highway between Toronto and St. Thomas is flat and straight, and there's not much to look at in the dark, just the occasional lit farmhouse and the exit signs catching your headlights. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I was just driving, and I was thinking about my son, about the man he is, the man he chose to be in a moment when the easier choice was obvious. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He just decided, quietly and firmly, that his father was worth standing up for. That the man who smelled like a bait shop and wore flannel and drove 2.5 hours with a cooler of fresh perch in the trunk was worth something. He learned that from his mother. I'd like to think he learned some of it from me. I've been doing this long enough to know that the lake doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care what your house looks like, or what your father did for a living, or whether you used the right fork at Christmas dinner. It just gives you what you earn, every morning, every season, every year. And after a while, you stop needing anybody else to tell you what you're worth, because the water already told you. What you leave behind isn't the square footage of your house or the title on your business card. It's the moment your kid decides, without being asked, that you matter. That's it. That's the whole thing. I'll take that over any Christmas table I've ever been turned away from.